Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Family barbecues and the Grant house were always the same, predictable down to the tinfoil covered trays of overcooked hot dogs and the awkward folding chairs pulled from every corner of the garage. The men huddled around the grill like it was a campfire where real wisdom was shared, while the women made small talk under the patio umbrella and tried not to burn in the sun. There were always too many paper plates and not enough napkins, and of course, there was always a toast. Some sentimental or cringeworthy moment where my dad would raise his beer can and declare something important for everyone to hear. I used to dread it because I knew, without fail, that I wouldn't be the one he toasted. Not really, not sincerely, not in the way he meant it when he looked at my brother like he'd built him from scratch. This particular year, I already knew what was coming before he clinked the side of his can with a butter knife and cleared his throat like he was about to announce a moon landing. My brother Luke had just landed a sales job, entry-level, basic pay, no benefits yet, but it came with a title and a desk and some vague promise of future commissions if he didn't get fired before then. To our father, that was enough. It made Luke a man, apparently. That's what he said, word for word. To Luke, Dad said, lifting his can high while Mom beamed like he'd just won a Nobel Prize. For finally becoming a man and getting a real job, one that requires a tie, not a joystick. There was laughter, loud, familiar, thoughtless laughter, the kind that floats easily around the yard because nobody wants to acknowledge the insult buried in it. I stood near the drink cooler, holding a sweating glass of lemonade that I suddenly didn't want. I didn't laugh. I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't even sigh. I just waited. And sure enough, my dad turned to me with that same smug grin he always wore when he was about to humiliate me with what he thought was humor. And to Emily, he added, mock raising his can again, who still just plays on her computer all day. We're all rooting for her to grow up one of these years. More laughter. A few chuckles from relatives I hadn't seen since the last holiday. Even Luke smirked and took a drink from his bottle like he was proud of whatever part he played in all this. I didn't react. That was the trick. I learned early that showing any sign of hurt only made them double down, thinking they'd finally gotten a rise out of me. So I smiled politely, took a slow sip of my lemonade, and then reached into my back pocket for my phone. I unlocked it with one tap, scrolled to the screenshot I'd saved just for this occasion, something I hadn't originally intended to share, but now felt like the only appropriate response. And I walked calmly over to where my father stood with his beer can still raised, like he was waiting for applause. "Hey, Dad," I said quietly, not loud, not theatrical. "Since we're sharing achievements, I thought you might want to see what playing on my computer all day actually looks like." He glanced down at my phone. I held it just high enough for him to see the image clearly, a monthly earnings report from one of my platforms. The net revenue line displayed in bold white text on a dark background. It read, net, $312,452.71. June. There was no mistaking what it was. My company name was at the top. The rest of the screen was filled with line items and client IDs, things he wouldn't understand but could easily tell were not fake. He stared at it. His mouth opened slightly, then shut again. His face flushed, not just red, but deep, uncomfortable crimson, and his eyes flicked back and forth across the screen like he was trying to find the joke, the catch, the trick. There wasn't one. Luke leaned over from his chair, casual at first, until his eyes landed on the number. His posture straightened so fast it looked like someone had pulled a string attached to his spine. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His expression crumbled in real time. Part disbelief, part embarrassment, and, under it all, unmistakable resentment. I waited a moment longer, watching them process it, before slipping the phone back into my pocket. I didn't gloat. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked back to the cooler, poured myself a fresh drink, and sat down in the shade like nothing had happened. The conversations around the yard shifted subtly. They weren't outright talking about me, not yet, but I could feel the shift in the air like the change before a thunderstorm. My cousin, one of those people who'd never asked me a single question about my work, suddenly appeared at my side with a polite smile and too much curiosity in her eyes. "So, what exactly is it that you do?" she asked, her voice light, innocent, too eager to be genuine. I looked up, smiled just enough to make her squirm, and said, "Just play on my computer." She blinked. I sipped. My father didn't say another word to me for the rest of the afternoon. He talked with Luke, laughed with uncles, grilled more chicken like nothing had happened. But he didn't look me in the eye once. And I knew what that meant. I knew that the power had shifted in a way he couldn't undo, that the version of me he had held on to for so long, lazy, unfocused, unserious, had been erased in one silent gesture, not through shouting or defending myself, just numbers. Numbers he couldn't argue with, numbers he wouldn't understand. The truth was, I had kept that world to myself for a reason. I didn't need their praise. I didn't crave their validation. But sometimes, silence is mistaken for failure. Sometimes, being invisible too long convinces them you've disappeared. That afternoon, I didn't disappear. I let the facts speak for me. I let the silence after the numbers do what decades of trying to be heard never could. And that was just the beginning. Growing up in the Grant household, it became clear early on that Luke wasn't just the favorite. He was the blueprint. He was the walking, talking embodiment of what my father believed a son should be. Loud without being questioned, confident without substance, and constantly rewarded for showing up with the bare minimum. From as far back as I can remember, Luke was treated like he had arrived in the world wearing a crown while I, just 2 years younger, had apparently arrived with a list of chores. My earliest memories of school were filtered through that lens. When Luke brought home a C, it was met with a shrug and a joke about boys being boys. When I brought home an A-, it came with a frown and a reminder that there's always room for improvement. At 8, Luke broke a neighbor's window with a football and got a handshake from Dad for having a strong arm. At 10, he was caught stealing candy from the gas station and somehow managed to walk away with both the candy and praise for being clever. I once stayed up all night building a science fair project that worked better than I expected, something with gears and a working switchboard, and when I brought home second place, my father barely looked up from his newspaper. "You should have aimed for first," he said, folding the page over like the conversation was over before it began. Luke was the kind of kid who left a mess everywhere he went. Shoes kicked off in the hallway, dirty dishes on the couch, unfinished projects scattered across the garage like landmines waiting to trip someone up. But Mom would clean up behind him without complaint, often humming to herself, like it was some honor to serve her son's chaos. Meanwhile, if I left so much as a coffee cup on the kitchen counter, it turned into a 30-minute lecture about self-respect and personal discipline. I used to try to tally the hours spent picking up after both of them, but somewhere along the way, I lost count. It wasn't just about chores or grades or who did what around the house. It was the language. The words my parents used when they talked about Luke always seemed to be dipped in gold, glowing with pride, even when they weren't earned. He's just got that spark. He's a natural leader. He's got real-world potential. I never fully understood what that last one meant, but it always hung in the air like an invisible banner above his head. I remember the first time I beat Luke at something that mattered, when we both took the same advanced placement exam in high school, and my score came back higher. I thought, foolishly, that this would be a turning point, that finally, my efforts would be seen as equal or better. Instead, Dad brushed it off. "Yeah, well, tests don't measure hustle," he said, like it was a reflex. Luke didn't even seem upset that I'd beaten him. He smirked and made some snide remark about me being a walking calculator. And the room erupted in laughter, like I'd just tripped over my own shoelaces. I stood there with the results still in my hand, feeling invisible even while holding proof that I'd won. That was the moment it truly sank in. Not just that I'd never be treated the same, but that the game itself was rigged before I ever sat down at the table. Years passed, and the dynamic never changed. Luke went off to college and flunked out in less than 2 semesters, blamed the professors, and came home with his tail between his legs. Dad called it a learning curve. Meanwhile, I stayed up nights applying for scholarships and ended up getting a full ride to a top-tier university, which somehow didn't even merit a celebratory dinner. When Luke got a DUI at 23, Dad called in a favor from a friend to keep it off his record and told me it was bad. A good reminder not to drink too much, even if you're just the passenger. I hadn't even been there. It would be easy to say I turned inward out of bitterness, but the truth is, I turned inward because it was the only place I felt like I could breathe. I discovered coding not because someone suggested it or encouraged me to explore tech, but because I needed something that made sense, something that had rules, something that didn't change based on who was asking or how loudly they spoke. Programming gave me a world where logic mattered more than charm, where solutions didn't care what your last name was or who your father bragged about at cookouts. I started freelancing quietly in college. Small projects at first, fixing broken WordPress sites, cleaning up buggy code for people who didn't know what they were doing. I charged less than I should have, worked more than I had to, and slowly built a reputation for delivering on time and under budget. It wasn't glamorous, and no one back home knew about it because they didn't ask. They never asked. I could have been juggling chainsaws in the backyard, and as long as Luke was nearby talking about his latest gym routine, the spotlight would have stayed firmly on him. The older I got, the more I realized that being overlooked had a strange power of its own. While Luke was out front soaking up every last drop of attention, I had the space to build without interruption. I could fail quietly, learn deeply, and make choices that weren't filtered through someone else's expectations. My success didn't happen in one big moment. It happened in thousands of small ones, late nights, quiet breakthroughs, contracts signed without celebration. Revenue milestones reached and passed with no one clapping but me. I didn't mind, not really. But somewhere deep down, there was still a part of me that wondered, if they ever saw it, if they ever knew the truth, would it even matter? Or would they find a way to twist it, like they always did? That was the question I carried with me through every all-nighter and every product launch. And it was the question that finally answered itself when my father toasted Luke like he'd climbed Mount Everest just for landing a desk job, and looked at me like I was still some teenager lost in fantasy. That was the moment I stopped wondering and started planning. By the time I turned 25, I had already built 2 revenue-generating web platforms, signed 4 long-term clients on retainer, and hired a part-time virtual assistant to help with back-end ticketing and user queries. None of this made it into family conversations. No one asked. At holidays, I'd sit on the couch with a glass of water in hand while someone passed me the mashed potatoes and asked if I was still working with computers. Not software development, not systems architecture, not UX optimization or automated analytics infrastructure. Just working with computers, like I was some help desk agent answering password reset emails. I nodded. I always nodded. Because correcting them felt like wasting energy, and I learned that nothing exhausted me faster than trying to explain my life to people who weren't actually listening. The truth is, by then, I was already deep into something far more complex than a simple client services business. What started as side projects, small websites, WordPress plugins, Shopify custom themes, had morphed into a proprietary product suite I coded from scratch over the course of a year and a half. It wasn't glamorous. I didn't get investor money or wear a blazer in a co-working space or post inspirational quotes on LinkedIn. I worked from my apartment, most days in gym shorts and an old hoodie, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt ambition and debugging functions until my eyes stung. I didn't need venture capital. I needed control. I didn't want a board. I wanted quiet. What they didn't know and never bothered to ask was that I was solving real problems for real people, platform migration issues, analytics dashboards for e-commerce sellers, machine learning recommendation models that improved click-through rates by up to 17%. I was doing the work people got paid six figures to do at tech firms, except I didn't have a degree in computer science or a fancy title. I had clients who trusted me and a bank account that kept growing. My main platform launched on a Monday, and by Friday, it had cleared its first $10,000. That was the month I crossed the six-figure threshold. I didn't celebrate. There was no one to celebrate with. Instead, I stared at the Stripe report like it had been sent to the wrong person. Then I did what I always did. I worked. I fixed the bugs I had flagged during testing, responded to the handful of onboarding support tickets, and stayed up past midnight reading user behavior and analytics until I could barely focus on the screen. People talk about success like it comes with fireworks. For me, it arrived wrapped in silence and a deep, aching tiredness that I couldn't shake. I hired a small support team not long after. Just two people, one for technical documentation, the other for live chat triage. I paid them well and treated them with the kind of respect I'd only ever seen go toward Luke. They stayed. They worked hard. We built something that hummed along beneath the surface of the internet, unseen by most, but quietly essential to a few thousand users who relied on it every single day. Meanwhile, my family still thought I was wasting time online. My father once asked if I was still doing those weird websites. I said yes, and he told me it might be time to consider real work. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so exhausting. There was a moment, about 6 months before that barbecue, when I almost gave them the full picture. My mother had called to tell me about Luke's new car, a mid-range sedan he couldn't afford but was so proud of. She gushed about how hard he'd been working, how things were finally clicking for him, and ended the call with a casual, "So how's your little business thing going?" I opened my mouth to tell her the truth, that I'd cleared over $300,000 that quarter, that I was negotiating licensing deals with 2 major e-commerce platforms, that I was speaking at a closed-door product summit in San Diego the following week. But instead, I told her it was fine. Just fine. Because I realized in that moment that no matter what I said, no matter how impressive the numbers were, no matter how polished the elevator pitch sounded, it wouldn't land. They'd nod politely and go back to talking about Luke's new workout routine or how many sales calls he had lined up for the week. They were emotionally invested in his story. Mine was just background noise, so I stayed quiet. Not out of shame, but out of strategy. There's power in silence, in letting people underestimate you long enough that they stop watching. While they pointed their spotlights elsewhere, I operated in the shadows, building something solid enough to stand without applause. Every now and then, I'd hear about Luke's latest pivot: insurance sales, real estate license, a short-lived podcast. Each time, Dad would bring it up over dinner or in passing, like Luke was on the verge of greatness, like he was still figuring things out and just needed time. Time was always on Luke's side. For me, time was something I had to justify. But none of that mattered anymore. Not after that barbecue. Not after the look on my father's face when he saw the numbers. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to downplay it or soften the impact. I let the truth land with all its weight, and I didn't flinch, because what they didn't know had already become what they couldn't ignore. Still, I knew that exposure alone wouldn't change everything. It never does. That was just the first ripple. The real shift was still coming. When the call finally came, it didn't arrive with any apology or acknowledgement, no sudden clarity or remorse in my father's voice. It was just after 8 on a Tuesday evening, and I was working through some final edits on a client dashboard when my phone lit up with his name. For a moment, I actually debated whether or not to answer, not out of malice or stubbornness, but because I knew what the call would really be about. And sure enough, within 60 seconds of his forced pleasantries, he got to the point. He asked, as casually as a man might mention a weather change, if I'd be willing to help out a little, now that I'm doing so well. The phrasing struck me. Not "we're proud of you," not "we were wrong," not even "we didn't know." Just this implied sense of entitlement, like the earnings I'd built. Every contract signed, every late-night coding sprint, every dollar earned under pressure, were simply sitting there, waiting to be tapped into because suddenly, now, it might benefit someone other than me. I didn't answer right away. I let the pause stretch long enough that I could hear him shuffle in his seat, clearing his throat like I owed him comfort for his discomfort. He talked about Luke, of course. How hard he'd been trying to get on his feet. How the job wasn't exactly what they expected. How the commission structure was complicated. How things were tight and the credit card interest had kicked in harder than planned. He used the word temporary like it was a magic spell. I could practically see him on the other end of the line, waving one hand in the air while the other stayed firmly on the steering wheel of a conversation he thought he was still controlling. It wasn't just about money, it never was. It was about power, about restoring the hierarchy that had defined our family since I was old enough to pour my own cereal. I told him I'd think about it. I said it calmly, without bitterness, and I let him hang up believing that maybe, just maybe, the door was still open. That night, I sat at my desk and drafted a short proposal. It wasn't financial. It was psychological. A simple deal, on paper. I would offer to settle Luke's debt, cover his outstanding credit, and even pay for the professional coaching course he'd mentioned once in passing. In return, I asked for only one thing: acknowledgement. I wanted my father to stand up in front of people who mattered to him, his friends, his church group, whoever, and speak plainly about my accomplishments. No jokes, no qualifiers, just the truth, said out loud, in his own voice. And I made it clear that this wasn't a demand for gratitude. It was a demand for recognition. I sent the proposal to his email the following morning. No attachments, no dollar amounts, just words. An offer that, by any measure, was generous beyond reason. And then I waited. The silence stretched for 3 days. On the 4th, I got a call from Luke instead. He was angry, not explosive, but simmering, like someone who'd been told they were entitled to something and then denied it. He said the whole situation was insane, that I was playing games with people who had always tried to support me, that I was turning success into leverage and family into some kind of transaction. I listened. I let him say everything he needed to say, and when he finally asked, "Why are you doing this?" I told him the truth, because for 30 years, I'd been the one carrying the weight of silence, of dismissal, of being treated like an afterthought. And now, for the first time, I had the ability to shift that balance, not to hurt anyone, not to destroy anything, but to force acknowledgement, to make it impossible for them to pretend that what I'd built wasn't real just because it didn't look the way they thought success should look. Luke didn't respond. He hung up. I knew he would. I didn't expect my father to go through with it. I figured he'd stew in his pride, find some other way to spin the story, maybe even try to borrow the money from one of his golf buddies. But on Sunday morning, just after 10, I got a message from a childhood friend who still lived in town. No subject line, just a link to a video and 2 words. He did. I clicked the link, already bracing for the cringe, for the watered-down version of events, for some halfway speech that would do nothing but irritate me further. But there he was, standing behind the podium at his church's community breakfast, looking visibly uncomfortable in his usual collared shirt and khakis. And as he spoke, I felt something unfamiliar curl in my chest. Not forgiveness, not quite vindication, but something close to understanding. He told them about me, about what I'd built. He didn't use vague phrases or couch it in humor. He said I had created something from nothing. He said I was one of the smartest people he'd ever known. He said he hadn't seen it before, and that he should have. He admitted, with words he likely choked on, that he'd spent too much time praising things he understood, and too little time trying to understand what he didn't. And then he said something that made me pause the video and stare at the screen. He said, "I thought being a man meant working with your hands and showing up early. But I forgot that brilliance can look like quiet, that success can look like a screen lit up at night when the rest of the world is sleeping." It wasn't perfect, it wasn't everything, but it was more than I expected. After the speech, I didn't call him. I didn't call Luke either. I had nothing to say. Not yet. I just sat there, alone in my apartment, watching the video a second time, then closing the laptop and letting the silence settle again. This time, it didn't sting, because I hadn't won anything. I had simply changed the rules. The next barbecue wasn't any different on the surface. Same checkered tablecloths, same rusted folding chairs, same half-hearted playlist, drifting through old speakers balanced precariously on the patio railing. But the air felt heavier, almost metallic, as if something unseen and unresolved had woven itself through the smoke curling off the grill and the clinking of cheap beer bottles. My mother had called the week before to invite me, her voice strangely neutral, as if nothing had happened and everything was just like it used to be. I said I would come, not because I felt obligated, and certainly not because I wanted some kind of emotional resolution, but because after everything that had passed between us, I needed to see them all in the light of what had been said and what had been done, now that the truth was out there and no one could stuff it back into the shadows. I arrived late on purpose. Not dramatically late, just enough that all the greetings had mostly settled, the seating arrangements had found their natural rhythm, and everyone had already begun slipping into their old conversational grooves. When I walked into the yard, people noticed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but I saw the subtle shifts. An aunt I barely knew nodded too quickly and turned away before I could even smile. My cousin's husband, who had once asked me if I ever thought about getting a real job, now couldn't seem to meet my eyes. And Luke sat by the fire pit with a red Solo cup in his hand, his face carefully blank, the kind of expression people wear when they're still trying to figure out what just happened to the shape of their world. My father was by the grill, as always, but for the first time, he wasn't holding court. He flipped burgers with more focus than necessary, like the meat would punish him if he looked away. And when I approached, he gave me a nod. That was it, no jab. No toast, no speech, just a nod. And while I knew better than to take that as an apology, I also knew it meant he didn't have the tools or the words to engage with me in this new configuration where I no longer needed him to say anything at all. The biggest difference that day wasn't what people said, it was what they didn't. There was no teasing about me still playing with computers, no remarks about my schedule or lifestyle. No one asked why I didn't bring a boyfriend or whether I was still doing that tech stuff. Instead, conversations shifted around me like I was a boulder dropped in a stream, the water finding other paths rather than pushing against what had clearly become immovable. Some relatives still smiled. A few even tried small talk, but the difference in tone was unmistakable, measured, cautious, almost formal. It was like they couldn't figure out whether I had become someone they should fear, admire, or quietly resent. Luke didn't speak to me until the sun was already setting, when most of the food had been eaten and people began packing up paper plates and leftover salads in Tupperware that would never find their way back to the right households. He approached as I stood by the garden fence, watching a pair of kids I didn't recognize chase each other across the lawn. He didn't smile, he didn't joke. He just stood beside me for a long moment, nursing the last of his drink, and finally muttered something that sounded like, "So that's it then?" I didn't ask him to clarify. I knew what he meant. I knew he wasn't asking about the barbecue or the speech our father had made, or even the money I'd refused to hand over after the fact. Once they'd proven they were willing to say the words but not actually change the behavior, he was asking if we could go back. If there was a way to reset the board, to return to a dynamic where I stayed small and he stayed big, where he was praised for trying and I was overlooked for achieving. And the answer, whether I spoke it or not, was no. There's no going back once you've seen clearly what people are willing to ignore when it doesn't serve them. No way to unsee the hierarchy they built with you at the bottom and called it love. There's no easy path back to the table after you've stood up in front of the whole family and revealed not just your power, but their blindness. It doesn't matter if you whisper it or scream it. The truth once spoken changes the shape of everything it touches. So I turned to him, met his eyes, and said the only thing I could say that wouldn't reduce the moment to something too simple or too cruel. You're going to have to figure out who you are without being the favorite. He didn't respond. He didn't look angry. He didn't walk away either. He just stood there silently, like someone who just realized the audience had gone home, and he was still performing. After he left, I stayed behind to help stack chairs. Not out of politeness, but because I wanted to see the whole thing through. I wanted to know how it would end. My mother said thank you, her voice tight but sincere, and my father gave me another one of those nods. Nothing more, nothing less. I didn't wait for anything beyond that. I left when the sun was gone, and the yard was almost empty, the echoes of laughter now distant, fading. Driving home, I didn't feel triumphant or bitter. I didn't replay the barbecue or the conversations, or even the long overdue look in my father's eyes when he realized what I'd become without him. I felt calm, steady, like I'd finished something that didn't have a proper name, but had needed to be finished for a long time. Some people still think this was about money. They think showing them that number, that absurd, undeniable number, was some kind of power move, a way to rub their ignorance in their faces or settle an old score. But the truth is, the number was never the point. The number was just proof. The real victory was taking back the story they thought they were writing for me, and letting them know, without ever raising my voice, that they were just side characters in it all along,